What do Babylonians eat?
His servants are given only the best.
Our God doesn't allow us to eat such foods.
You fear your God?
I do.
Well, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. He insists on these selections to maintain your strength and vitality. What if he should see you looking worse in appearance than the other youths? You would make me guilty before the king. I must obey the king. So must you.
Please, test your servants for 10 days. And let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink.
Vegetables.
Just give us 10 days.
And then deal with your servants according to what you see.
My lord, these young men are of
I know
war.
who they are. We've been watching you. All of you. You don't bow to our idols. You pray only to your God. And you are not eating our foods.
They insisted that their God would
Yet
not allow them.
somehow, you look healthier than the others. Continue giving them the diet they've requested. And Belteshazzar, your future is bright. Don't waste it.
I feel as though now we've established that the book of Daniel is a forgery and none of this actually happened. It lifts a burden from my shoulders. I no longer need to analyze this narrative as to what did or didn't happen. I can look at this purely from the point of view of a film critic, which I'm not really. Being a film critic is not really my specialty. I would recommend channels like Chris Stuckman if that's your thing. But I do obviously enjoy films, and I have a bit to say about the quality of this particular film. This whole issue with the food problem, I think, takes up way too much of the narrative. They devote way too many minutes in the opening of this film to what amounts to a dietary issue. Daniel and his colleagues feel they are forbidden by Mosaic law from partaking of the food the Babylonians offer them. The Babylonians are insistent, but Daniel and his associates say, well, here's a compromise. Give us vegetables to eat for 10 days, and then come and see what the results are. And if you don't like what you see, we'll come up with another plan. And at the end of the 10 days, they've done all right on vegetables. That's the story. That's the narrative. It's the sort of thing where if this were a Hollywood film, I doubt that would have been given more than a couple of minutes because it's just not interesting. But because it's a cult that's behind this film, and this detail is important because this is a cult that, for example, wants Jehovah's Witnesses to distinguish themselves in all sorts of ways, including their medical choices, this becomes a big issue. This becomes something where they want to show an example from the Bible of a Bible character, a Bible hero, making a stand on a seemingly small issue. So I know why the organization has made a big deal of this whole dietary dispute in this film. I don't think Hollywood would have done this, though, because ultimately it's a bit boring.
Which star of Enlil is brightest in the Urgula constellation? Do you know?
It is the Lugau star.
Impressive. There is a tower that is high, but nonetheless has no shade. What is it?
Your ziggurat?
Hopeless. You can solve the riddle?
It is sunlight, my lord.
Correct. My wise men teach that the gods are responsible for everything. If that's so, why do the good suffer and the evil prosper?
No one's been able to answer.
As you say, O king, the wise do not always have the food, nor do the intelligent always have the riches, nor do those with knowledge always have success, because time and unexpected events overtake them all.
Who wrote those words?
Solomon.
Famed for his wisdom.
But its source was his God, our God, Jehovah.
Take them away.
When should we return?
You won't. Go back to your families. Proven worthless. Belteshazzar, no. Not the four of you. We have more to discuss. I do not know your God, but you've proven to be 10 times better than any priest or conjurer I've met. Ashpenaz will arrange for you to serve in the palace with my wise men. Maybe your gifts were wasted in Jerusalem, but here, they'll be put to use.
So what we have here is a scene apparently intended to contrast the superiority of Daniel and his colleagues with the comparative inferiority of fellow Hebrews who also came from Jerusalem, but who weren't doing things properly. So it all really goes back to the food incident. If you watch the whole film, you'll notice that there were some Hebrews who weren't observing the dietary restrictions of Mosaic law. They weren't being as righteous as Daniel. And here we're seeing, basically in Nebuchadnezzar's throne room, what the results are of that. The message seems to be, if you want to do well, if you want to prosper, if you want to be blessed by Jehovah, you need to follow the letter of what's expected of you. You cannot cut corners. You have to show in every area that you're taking your faith seriously. So I think that's the overall message of this throne room scene. I also find it interesting how they use it as an opportunity to show how wise and profound Bible verses must have been when read out to foreign rulers back then. They use the example of Ecclesiastes 9, verse 11. I have seen something further under the sun, that the swift do not always win the race, nor do the mighty win the battle, nor do the wise always have the food, nor do the intelligent always have the riches, nor do those with knowledge always have success. because time and unexpected events overtake them all. When I was one of Jehovah's Witnesses, this was one of the few Bible verses that really made sense to me, especially in the context of dealing with my own personal tragedy of losing my mother. I can remember being asked by fellow witnesses, do you feel angry at Jehovah? And I would say no, because time and unexpected events overtake all of us. It's just a fact that terrible things happen to everyone. No one should expect any unique blessing, any preferential treatment when it comes to their worship or when it comes to their very existence. And yet what I find interesting about this verse is the way the organization routinely ignores this principle when it comes to the way it invokes Jehovah's hand. Whenever something goes the organization's way, whenever an individual receives some money or receives some kind of benefit due to their having served Jehovah acceptably, it's said, oh, well, this is clear evidence of Jehovah's hand. And of course, they ignore the many examples of Jehovah's Witnesses suffering, and in some cases even dying. They cherry pick the good stories and ignore the tragedies. And that, for me, is actually ignoring this verse here in Ecclesiastes. Whenever they invoke Jehovah's hand, as far as I'm concerned, they're ignoring this verse. They're ignoring this wisdom from Solomon, which, if you think about it, although it makes sense, it's not really an answer to the question. The question was, why do the good suffer and why do the evil prosper? If I were answering that question, I would say, well, what's your evidence that the good exclusively suffer and the evil exclusively prosper? Isn't it more likely that the good both suffer and prosper, and that the evil both suffer and prosper? In other words, where's your evidence that it swings one way or the other? Where's this black and white ideology coming from? So maybe my answer would have been even more wise than the wisest of all people who ever lived, who apparently was Solomon, who also had hundreds of wives and ended up worshipping other gods. But we won't talk about that. So yes, this was just an interesting scene, quite apart from them trying to juxtapose Daniel versus the less than perfect Hebrew exiles. There's also this small matter of Ecclesiastes 9 verse 11, which the organization routinely ignores when it's discussing Jehovah's hand.
The victory in Jerusalem is complete. Our forces are now preparing to besiege Tyre.
They should remember what happened to Zedekiah. The gods are with us.
Many died, and they burned down Jehovah's house.
Why didn't our people listen? Did they think Jehovah couldn't see what they were doing?
As long as our temple existed, our people had hope.
As long as Jehovah exists, we have hope.
But he's rejected us because of our unrighteousness.
He hasn't. Not everyone. Jehovah told Ezekiel that in his eyes, you are as righteous as Noah and Job.
He said that.
He did.
If Jehovah cares so much, And why are we in exile? Why can't we go home? Why can't we be together?
You are home, son. I don't have all the answers. Stay close to Jehovah. You will be blessed.
I don't have all the answers. Stay close to Jehovah. You will be blessed. You can see why they've included that line. Because Daniel in this scene is really depicting the way Jehovah's Witnesses will feel when they feel overwhelmed by doubts, when they feel as though there's no point to anything. Let's say they're feeling the weight of their cognitive dissonance and the penny's starting to drop and they're realizing that this might actually not be God's one true religion. And this is the governing body effectively saying to them, stay with Jehovah. Just stick with Jehovah no matter what, and everything will magically sort itself out. But in this scene, we also, of course, have yet more historical revisionism, or to put it more bluntly, pseudo-history. I've already made a video on the subject of 607 BCE and 1914. If Tibor is gracious, a thumbnail will magically appear where my finger is. But yeah, I've dealt with this subject at length. Jerusalem wasn't destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar's forces in 607 BCE. That actually happened 587 BCE. Again, there is a 20-year difference between the date assigned by Jehovah's Witnesses, and only Jehovah's Witnesses, and the date assigned by scholars and historians. And this is no small thing. This isn't just some error. The governing body are being deliberate in doubling down on this year of 607 BCE, even though they are flying in the face of the academic community and essentially saying to historians and scholars, we know better than you. Simply because predecessors in our religious movement got it wrong and said that it was 607 and used this year as a basis to predict 1914 and the last days and the establishment of true worship, or the re-establishment of true worship in 1919. Because we've already sold this idea through decades of our literature, we'll stick with the 607, thank you. We know better. We know history better than those who have devoted their careers to studying it. As I explain in my video, there's no room for error here. The Neo-Babylonian period was one of the trickiest times in history for you to simply fake an event like the destruction of a major city, because the Neo-Babylonians wrote down everything on clay or cuneiform tablets so that every year is accounted for, so that we're able to categorically state that this event in fact happened in 587 BCE. So, quite frankly, the governing body are lying here. Just as they lied at the beginning of the film about 617 BCE, they're lying again about 607 BCE. They need their dates to be apart from what scholars and historians are saying by 20 years, because they are so heavily invested in this 607 1914 theology. I also found it interesting in that scene, the part where Daniel says,
as long as our temple existed, our people had hope.
As long as Jehovah exists, we have hope.
I found that quite an interesting line. As long as our temple existed, Our people have hope. Well, what is a temple? It's a building. This goes back to what I was saying earlier about this organization's fixation on buildings. Apparently, God needs buildings. And even though Daniel's corrected by his mother here, I think that this line is a little bit deliberate, just conveying this idea that buildings are important. As long as our temple existed, our people had hope. Well, what about all the people who would have been living around that time in completely different parts of the world, with completely different cultures and completely different religions, many of whom would have been living in prosperity, and they didn't have the temple, they didn't have Judaism? Are we seriously suggesting that at that particular moment in history, the only way you could have hope would be if you lived in a particular part of the world and followed a particular religion and worshipped at a particular temple? You can see how narrow-minded all of this is. It's all very Judaism-centric, isn't it? As it has to be if you're going to faithfully tell the story that's in the Bible. But manifestly, there would have been many, many peoples and cultures and nations at that time, some not prospering, some prospering, irrespective of what religion they were following. But from a Jewish perspective, it's only our way, only if you follow our religion, only if you worship at our temple, can you have hope, can you be prosperous? Doesn't that sum up the attitude of Jehovah's Witnesses? They simply cannot conceive of living a life of happiness and prosperity outside of their bubble.